the first of a series of very varied environmental humanities public lectures that the Centre for Environmental Humanities will be running this term. And it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Julian Wolfreys to you. On a personal level, I've been sort of in communication with Julian for many years, and we've sort of exchanged quite a bit, haven't we, via email, but we haven't actually met in person, so it's very, very nice to have the opportunity to invite him up to Bath Spa. So I first knew Julian as an editor extraordinaire. One of the many books that he's edited was, the first iteration of it was Introducing Criticism at the 21st Century, and there is a second edition which is being translated into Hindi and Chinese, which is updated to Introducing Criticism in the 21st Century. If you're interested in eco-criticism, I can recommend a chapter on here. It's written by one Kate, I think. So anyway, that was how I first met Julian, but of course Julian is also a noted literary scholar in his own right. And indeed he's the author or editor of some 40 books, more than 40 books, which is mind-blowing, prodigiously productive. And he's of course Professor of Literature and Director, I better actually check this so I get it right, Director of the Centre for Studies in Literature at the University of Portsmouth. But he is far more than that as well. I discovered that he had a band and discovered the wondrous music that they play, of which I hope we'll hear some. Very difficult to categorise, but really love the music. And then I just discovered recently he also does solo piano. And his most recent solo piano album is very richly called Philosophizing with a Hammer, which is an allusion to Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. It's tapping, it's a hammer that you tap on concepts to see if they're hollow. But this is playing on the piano, operating through hammers. And each of the pieces on this piano is a kind of a meditation, a meditative response to the work of a particular European philosopher, not Foucault, like we all want to know Foucault would be there. Deleuze's. In addition, I had the great pleasure of reading this extraordinary novel, very haunting novel, Silent Music, which I heartily recommend to you, and I should say actually quite a few of Julian's works are available for sale here. A very small percentage of the over 40, but some of them, and also some albums as well. And he is a poet. So we have a novelist, a poet, a musician, and a literary theorist, a literary scholar, a man of many parts. So Julian, and also he has been working increasingly in this area of literature, music, place, sound and place, and this is the focus for his presentation today. So welcome Julian, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you to all of you for so generously inviting me here. I feel I should go now because I don't think I can do better than my introductions. A little bit of shameless entrepreneurialism, if I may, in a good cause. I brought with me some copies of this book called The Grand European Vestry, which I'll be reading a couple of poems from later on, and some CDs, which are recordings of the poems with some loosely kind of psychedelic, slightly stoned, the music not me, free jazz compositions, with more that comes from this and from another book which is over there called Draping the Fly for a Snowfall. These particular items are on sale in aid of the World Wildlife Fund. So if you happen to like what you hear, and if you happen to not dislike it too much, and you care to buy copies, I'd be very happy if you did, and all the money will go to the charity. This is also some shameless advertising. It's meant to bombard you with images while I talk so that you give in at the end of my talk. My dean tells me I need to do less. This is partly my band, partly solo work. And at the moment, everything on the website is currently free to explore and download, with the suggestion you make a donation, because all of the downloads, if you donate, will go to World Wildlife Fund, and they're doing this for the next month. So it doesn't really matter if you like it or not, does it? It's in the good cause. Okay, my talk today is called And for a Moment, Voicing the Landscape. And this has a particular kind of resonance for me, giving this paper in Bath, because for generations my family has come from the West Country, specifically Wiltshire and Dorset, going back more than 1,000 years. And if I don't go on too much with the paper and I get to reading poetry, you'll get some references. So this is very much, this landscape is very much a home landscape for me, through Bath, down to the Dorset coast, through the West Country. And I understand what it means to dwell, even though one needn't necessarily reside there. Two quotations to begin with. The first from Martin Heidegger. The proper dwelling plight lies in this, that mortals ever search anew for the essence of dwelling, that they must ever learn to dwell. What if man's homelessness consisted in this, that man still does not even think of the proper plight of dwelling as the plight? Yet as soon as man gives thought to his homelessness, it is misery no longer. Rightly considered and kept well in mind, it is the sole summons that calls mortals into their dwelling. The next passage, slightly longer, comes from Silent Music, which is published by a press in Dorset, Trial Press. And I want to thank Andrew, who's here tonight, who published this novel, had faith in it in the first place, and chose this passage. Thank you. Drifting that day, one of bright colours already alight, made brighter still, yellow in blue, all embracing orange, greens dark or bleached to tired straw. Everywhere we turned, in all we saw, colours become metrical, the real of the world transfigured into shapes impressing on the eye a thread by which we are entwined with all we see. The lapse of time felt intensified through the eye, visible meter, the repetition of the identical. I see the world, I am in the world, I am the world. And the world is me. Or rather, on that day, we were all the world, and the world was all that mattered. The world that day was held in suspension between two times, between its unfolding, gradual rolling, and between all the cues to what had seemed fixed in place and which returned here and again, the sun complicit with the tempi of that world, colour, light, hue, shade, tone, burning bright or deepening dark, all mid-tones vanished in lyrical measure of this July palette. Rhythms of the eye and the voice, field folding upon field, unfolding beneath hills, dips and sharp or smooth declivities caught the eye at every moment. Between times in its solution, suspended in its ebb and flow, we drifted, drifting, touched by the sun, steered by heat and light, floating on the lightness of a summer's day, going with the drift, the course, the current, rippling brilliance on a summer sea, gull and crow, bleat of sheep, bringing home the goodness, motorbike or horse passing, being passed, fast, slow, slower, halt, a herd of milkers filling the lane, tails swatting flies, east of Orvia, driven, driving, shifting, digressing, dawdling, meander motions as the day goes on, without seeming to move, unfolding time, recursive time, weaving in and out, around and back, stories exchanged. And I started with that passage because for me it's a response to more than 30 years of reading Heidegger and coming to terms with the notion of dwelling, which I feel I'm only just being able to do. But I wanted to move between creative and critical faculties, as it were, today, in talking about the voice of the landscape and how the poet voices the landscape. And for most of the talk this evening, I'll be talking about just two poems by Alice Oswald called Field and extracts from By Pittenweem by John Burnside from his 4 quartets. I made a hard choice between should I give you lots of little fragments or just a couple of longer fragments. And I went with the couple because I think these do a number of things which I hope we can open up for discussion later on, which a lot of their poetry does, and which embrace what their work is about. So, as a beginning, as good as any other, I find myself and invite you to imagine yourselves there also in a field. Not any field, but a particular field. Alice Oswald's field. Easter night, the mine's midwinter, I stood in the big field behind the house at the centre of all visible darkness. A brick of earth, a block of sky, there lay the world, wedged between its premise and its conclusion. Some star let go a small sound on a thread, almost midnight. I could feel the earth's soaking darkness squeeze and fill its darkness, everything spinning into the spasm of midnight, and for a moment, this high field unhorizon hung upon nothing, barking for its owner, burial widowed, moonless, seeping, docks, grasses, small windflowers, weep holes, wires. The field is more than one, limitless in principle, unhorizon as Oswald has it, at first but only momentarily a brick and a block of earth and sky, the forms mirroring, complementing, supplementing one another, promising to become infinite in their reciprocal doubling. Endlessness intimated, promised as a result of the visible being sucked into visible darkness, spinning as it were into a black hole, into the spasm of midnight, the field. And with it the self, all that is and all that is in the natural world, including poetry, this poem in particular, with its fragmentary lines, the generous openness of its punctuation, alliteration, and repetition, variations shifting ground between its premise and its conclusion, sound supplementing sight, the felt, the tactile, the heard overcoming the distance of the observed, the here and there of sovereign self and object world. And with that, the continuity of Gerard without subject that enacts the pulse of the poem, soaking, spinning, seeping, these sibilants being just a few of the text's siblings that sound performatively in and as the feeling of the text, as they in turn translate with a susurrating onomatopoeia the sonority of the night world's flora and foliage in a manner that exceeds, deconstructing from within the mere limitations of mimetic empiricism. We must begin again, of course, with the obvious, admitting, if we are to talk of the natural world, that natural is a construct of mind. This is, after all, the mind's midwinter, the calendrical marker of Easter night, marking the inaugural mediation of self and time, self and place, subject and world, space and time intertwined. Nature is a construct, and therefore to be suspended in a moment of perception, and for the duration of the reflection, at least, on those diacritical marks suggestive of the epoche, that the poem insinuates through its registration of the liminal, the measureless time between all that is to be seen and all that will be merely visible darkness. The paradox the self presents, staging itself in the act of being consumed, becoming other as it disappears into that dark with which it becomes one. For darkness is not the absence of the visible, it is instead an infinite plenitude, an excess beyond measure that is all too visible, engulfing the eye, and the eye, filling as it does the mind's eye, this being after all, and to return to the beginning, the mind's midwinter. And all that is the natural world includes on the one hand, therefore, the self, the eye who, appearing nearly twice, stands and feels whilst becoming consumed by the abyssal dark, dissolving as she speaks, bearing witness, becoming other and becoming one. And on the other hand, the field of poetry in which this poem finds itself, like the subject saying I, finding itself in the mind's midwinter and a field at the back of the house. Poetry is a field as vast, as potentially infinite, as the world in darkness. In its irrecusably fragmentary status, the mere breaking of lines renders the reading of poetry resistant to wholeness. Every trace of poetry presents a whole in itself immeasurably vast and much greater than any whole poem. The poem is that place, a topography in ruins, where the self comes closest to the world it experiences. To paraphrase partially and cite in fragments Maurice Blanchot, the fragmentary does not exclude totality, but rather goes beyond it, each time, each line, each mark, each trace mobilizing, rendering mobile the whole, the totality of the world, the field of vision as poetic experience, even while that mobilization interrupts the whole, suspending the thinking of the totality in various ways. In the poetic, where the mark on the page mediates access to experience of being in the world, inviting us to dwell on how the world gives a calling to us to dwell, the good poet, which is to say the good reader, must accept the renunciation of any assumed presence, any assumed mastery of the landscape, and with that any sense of property or propriety. For, as Alice Oswald's poetry illuminates, giving us to see, and as also does John Burnside's poetry, though differently naturally, however they may appear to share in turning to and dwelling on, dwelling in the world, the self is expropriated from itself, in its proper reflection on the world, on landscape. Poetry of landscape such as that of Oswald and Burnside, but also Kathleen Jamie, Geoffrey Hill, Thomas Hardy and others, and with this the poetics of landscape that suspends the self and narrative in the prose of Hardy once again, Woolf, Dickens too, though differently, his being urban and a built landscape. The others finds in the phenomenological apperception of the self's enfoldedness in the world a condition of expropriation, as I've said. And thus, if one reads Oswald or Burnside reading the land from this perspective, one finds oneself becoming involved in a mutation of space and place, site and locus. And this mutation, in one's becoming aware of no longer being separated from the place in which one finds oneself, one's being enfolded, and therefore one's becoming conscious of a folding that is the intimate intertwining of self and world. This involves not only an aesthetic or phenomenological mutation, an unveiling of the phenomenological consciousness, but also a mutation, therefore, of the socio- and geopolitical space, a political and a juridical mutation, but above all, an ethical conversion of the self, expropriated from any desire for a mastering selfhood in a proper apperception. Poetry is revealed, therefore, giving to us indirectly that earth's soaking darkness, the visible darkness, or darkness visible, in Oswald's echo of that Miltonian image, his forceful oxymoron from Paradise Lost, to quote Robert Edgeworth. This demi-world half seen or witnessed as a moment coming to pass is echoed in another fashion in the phrase "mind's midwinter," a phrase calling to mind both John Donne, "'Tis the year's midnight and it is the day's Ulysses," and also T.S. Eliot, "Midwinter spring is its own season, sempiternal, though solemn towards sundown, suspended in time between pole and tropic." Poetry, in short, has the possibility of extending beyond representation to form a making, a poiesis, suggestive of radical expropriation that the subject undergoes in its very definition as a welcoming of the other. To read the world as this coming to consciousness that enacts a spatio-temporality of passing, and so to enfold the world around the self as Oswald does, is to receive the hospitality that she offers in her own home. She receives through the reading and tracing of the world's expropriation of the self, hospitality from her own home, which ultimately does not belong to her. The host, as host, is a guest. Suspended in time, and for a moment, the writing of a phenomenologically, apperceptively welcoming poetry, a poiesis of welcoming and hosting, the poet voices the landscape, giving voice to the other, makes a place, a space in which the voice of the land, the writing of the world can come to take place, to be borne witness to be recorded, and to be made iterable beyond the immediacy and singularity of any field of experience. Oswald's poetry gives us to see how one is a guest, but also as an inhabitant of the land, a refugee, an exile, a guest, and not an owner. the hospitality that poetry makes possible, and originary dispossession, the withdrawal that expropriates the owner. The self takes place, as François Ravoul puts it insistently, with some urgency in his reading of Jacques Derrida's reading of Emmanuel Levinat's At the Place of the Other. Such tracing of expropriation in this ethical opening in singular and fragmented instances, to use Oswald's line again, for a moment, then another, then another, consciousness coming to reflection of and on itself in the poem as it taking place, being staged, being given ground, grounded in the land. This is what can be said, what can be read as the connective skein between Oswald and Burnside. For while Oswald's momentary surges, her upwelling of expropriative staging, is readable in the light of a certain Levinasian ethics, filtered through Derrida and a phenomenological engagement, there is too here in this and many of her other poems a realization, quite by chance, of a particular late Heideggerian stance. Written in 1962, Heidegger's lecture on time and being addresses expropriation, arguing that expropriation belongs to appropriation, which is in itself expropriation, in the sense that appropriation expropriates itself of itself. Thus the poetic self, the I who responds, who answers the call of the landscape, does not, as Heidegger puts it, abandon itself. Rather, it preserves its own, in its withdrawal, its dissolution, its retreat. Oswald offers us a reading of the self as other, as subject taken in by the land responding to the call, the demand of the land that calls one to one's dwelling, as Heidegger puts it, and which John Burnside acknowledges in the citation that served both as my epigraph and also to his collection, The Asylum Dance. It has to be admitted that I have begun badly today, finding myself in the midst of a field, in the middle of a field, fields ever expanding and happily losing myself in the process. The more I dwell, the more I reflect on Oswald's act of opening of the self, so the field expands further. Oswald loses the self, expropriating, fragmenting the self in lines and mobilizations, in acts of placing the self in fields, the field behind the house, the field of poetry, and the field of temporal flow, subjectively apprehended as it is implicitly recursive through the implication of times moving and times returning. The writer of the natural world, if he or she is a good writer, must first be a good reader. To be a good reader of the natural, of nature, one must lose oneself in that nature, realizing the process of becoming one's being in the world, being with, intimately enfolded within the field of vision. And I was tempted here to make a snide remark about Robert Macfarlane's work, but I resisted. I think very roughly and reductively speaking, there are two camps of nature writing around the moment. There is the one that loses itself, that gives itself up, that is the good host and becomes the guest to the land. And then there is still that kind of post-Wordsworthian romantic attempt at mastery. It's that photograph of Macfarlane that advertises the most recent book, where he's standing, looking very martial, very phallic, on the edge of a hill on a mountain. And it's so weird. What I've wanted to make you see, what I want to make you hear, what I want to make you feel today is how the voice, let's call it the voice of the poet, insinuates itself as a fragment within, folded into, even as it folds itself within, into folds, the fissures, the mesh, both weave and gap, constituting the weave of the world, subjective world of pieces without totality, and yet suggestive of all the world is, all that remains as unmeasurable and ungraspable as visible darkness, an immensity staged in the formative discourse of the self's implication in the apperception of the world, where mise en scène always already overflows into the mise en abîme. Writing the landscape, one writes oneself in that place, seeing, feeling that place, transmitting and translating that place, becoming the place. Reading become writing, become the map and ruins, ungovernable traces, save when understood just as the world, plotted, to quote John Burnside, with kill sights and whispers. There is no obvious correlation, similarity, or relation between the two, save for the announcement that the place is plotted by. Though Oswald's world is more contained ostensibly than Burnside's, it remains equally recalcitrant to order, taxonomy, mastery, understanding, except on its own terms. And thus, even as the self disappears into the landscape it observes and writes itself into, so the world withdraws in being foregrounded through the representation of its ruinous traces. On the page, for all to see, yet nowhere as such, nowhere in all ways, moments of trace suspended, endlessly substituting for and supplemented by each and every other trace that momentarily comes to pass as one of yet another constellated concatenation of traces signing the singularity of sight in the creation of the poetic text. We see the trace, but too we read of and so feel trace of another unseen trace, and so on. We find ourselves within the fragmentary exigency in both Oswald and Burnside's poetry, even as we find ourselves in the world, in the landscape, the field of vision, the field of the text, the fields in which Oswald and Burnside find themselves, and it might be added in passing, the spatio-temporal fields of a recursive network, in harmony with those fields that have come to be perceived through the discourse of contemporary physics. The poetry of Burnside and Oswald give us insight acutely through those momentary surges of consciousness and place, the suspensions of time. More than that, it is as if they place us in the same field, fields that open onto consciousness, reflection, and memory. Responding to the voice of the landscape, the sound to which they give voice, even as they bear witness, they figure through the fragment and expropriation. An unsettling opening, Blanchot's ouverture onto something new and unpredictable, a space of risk within the ordinary world, as if they were both an opening and a beginning, an initiative or a tendency, perhaps especially an invitation to respond, a certain kind of appeal. Burnside's world is often made of sounds in the absence of sight. The sight is as much as sight composed for a moment of an otherwise indefinable oscillation, a resonance, a sonic scintillation in harmony with the universe, possibly resonating at 432 Hz. Something, as Burnside has it, that quote, I heard in the wind, geese, or the call of a vixen, or something else beyond vocabulary. And sometimes at night I feel myself alone in the dark, and looking to see what there is between the near field and the kitchen door. And we are feeling ourselves in a place where we look but cannot see and having heard. Notice how the poet shifts tenses. The sound from the past as a memory become a feeling of self, not seeing itself, the world being dark, the self all alone, alone enough so as to be invisible to itself, one more ghost amongst ghosts. Those, quote, old familiars shifting in the grass beyond the garden. Mute ghosts come from the sea, the gods that only stones and bulbs recall. Rising like smoke, waiting to be found in the cry of a bird or the promise of a midnight frost, though nothing but come in form I could recognise. No storybook figure, no cold face pressed to the glass, no girl in the attic weeping or clutching a doll, no eerie scene out along the hedge some August afternoon. Tonight, when I stop to imagine nothing is there, or only a mist of rain on the leftover pea sticks, a glint of light, or something like a cry that might be nothing, only other world unending, yet lost throughout time. In a circle of light, a murmur comes through wind, a hand's breadth, a wingspan, arriving from nowhere or conjured out of the dark, between the near field and the kitchen door, to sound me out, to comfort me with nothing. Once again, I lose myself in the poem as I had at the beginning with Oswald. I find by Pitt and Wing particularly, but all of the four quartets are quite amazing poem. I would have happily substituted a reading of Burnside's poem for a talk about Burnside and Oswald. I find an opening which in turn opens me to the world, to that exigency, that risk of opening. I find myself carried away within the poem, in the landscape that Burnside conjures, moving between the tenses and the senses, searching in vain and finding nothing at first, a series, a signature, as Derrida calls it, the paradoxical singular signature that is known only through its iteration, its guarantee of alterity and withdrawal, and with this the revenance as trace of the other, being the trace of the self, the other of the self, in the self. A literal negations, coming to rest in the ambiguity, if not the unknowability, the very undecidability of that final nothing that might be said to comfort, rather than being the signifier of the absence of anything. To sound me out, to comfort me with nothing. Nothing is nothing, but that nothing is everything, for it is a dwelling, in the Heideggerian sense, captured in that citation of Heidegger's, used by Burnside in the epigraph to the Asylum Dance. It is also that dwelling that Burnside unfolds, calls forth in its nothingness as a staring off to somewhere memorized, some open plain, eyes on the grass mapped out in song, which comes from Part 4, History of by Penguin, the second of Burnside's 4 quartets. That staring off into somewhere memorized, some open plain, is, I like to think, the equivalent of Oswald's unhorizon. We can only show the landscape in fragments, in what we experience ourselves. And in that, there is the totality and the impossible infinity that we can barely apprehend. I remember it once coming to me, went out for a run, and I saw crows rising from a copse. And as I was running, with the sound, I was listening, I had an iPod on my other phone, and it was the sound of the first unaccompanied cellist, Bach, just happened to come on at that moment, and everything seemed to fit. And without wanting to seem too mystical, everything seemed to be of a place in the world, and I thought I understood something, but then I lost it all again, which is why I write poetry. I'm grasping after something because I don't understand. Burnside's found, observed, and remembered phenomena each have their own voices, their own songs. For their return, spectres that all too material come to pass with the disturbance of and in the field to which the text attests, even as it constitutes it, and the field of vision, the field that the text gathers, and the field that just is the text, causing us to feel the sight, ourselves enfolded and enfolding the world of ruins. Now, Burnside and Oswald each stand in the same place, spatially considered, which is to say at the back of a house in a field adjacent to their dwelling place. Each stands in relation to the world in a manner not wholly similar, yet not dissimilar. And in thinking about these spatial relations, I got to thinking, as I was coming in today, of Hardy's first extant poem, Domicilium, which is a wonderful example, I think, of the way in which representation gives way to our perception. And if you don't know it, it's worth searching out. Very, very briefly, I shall digress if I may, as I always feel I need to talk about Domicilium. Hardy stands before the family home, and he describes it first of all as if it were a painting. As he says in the subtitle of Under the Green Tree, a painting of the Dutch school. And he describes the foreground as foreground. He describes the middle ground with the fruit trees, which, by the way, are rust apples. You can go and pick them. They're wonderful. And then there's a hedge, and then there's the ivy growing up the side of the house, and then there's the uncultivated hills behind, and then the horizon and the sky. It's a Kantian moment. It's a moment of the sublime approaching. And that's in the present. He stands there. And from that standing in the present, in the landscape, and feeling himself part of it, that opens up to being the voice of his long-dead grandmother, who was born. You can work out the times approximately by reading the poem, because the poem is written in 1870, and Hardy is recalling when he was about 9 or 10, so this is 30 years before, and the grandmother had talked to him, and she remembered the family settling in the area of Bockhampton. And it was sometime in the 18th century. So she opens up time. She is the opening, she is the voice of the other in the landscape, coming to welcome us, to be the host, so that we can enter and we can momentarily dwell with her, with the voice of the landscape, which is the voice of the dead as well. But to come back, each place is singular and yet sharing in the writer's apperception of the self, expropriating self, abandoning the struggle to master the world as if it were neoclassical or romantic landscape, I say that with a certain irony, realising just who designed the landscape around here. Property of the self, propriety of representation as synecdoche for the human assumption of dominion over the totality of the world. Where is the difference, broadly speaking, between Oswald and Burnside? Well, Oswald resides and dwells in a moment, for a moment of dwelling, reflecting consciousness as consciousness of the natural. I find that reading Oswald over and over again, she frequently pauses in a moment. She embodies or embraces the suspension, the epoche, the phenomenological bracketing, if you will. And so everything opens from that. Burnside's bracketing is one of memory coming back. And it's a very interesting, and I'm talking with a friend who's a Burnside scholar just yesterday about this. And I said, am I right in thinking that in the poetry there are always memories of children in collectives, while in the novels there are always children isolated and alone? And she said, that's absolutely right. Yes, most of the time in novels, the children wander destroyed landscapes, and they're alone, they're unfriendly, they're without anyone. While in the poems, groups of children come back reclaiming the land through memory for Burnside as he looks off into that horizon, that unhorizon horizon. So Burnside places the self as a shuttle between the weave of the world's times, evoking and invoking memory, the nothing that is memory, memory being neither material nor immaterial. Memory is the spore, the trace returning, an apparition that erupts within the presence, deconstructing the present and presence of the self to self, hence expropriation and opening. Thus, whether through the revenance of memory in Burnside or the suspension of the moment in Oswald, and both return to these gestures or strategies of perception, each involving a bracketing of time in the contemplation and perception of place, as the call to consciousness or being in the world, consciousness thus understood like the lines of a poem, articulating that consciousness, that fragment. Each addresses the proper understanding of the landscape's call in an act of being host to the world. This gesture that gives place to voice is framed in other terms by Edmund Husserl in Ideas. We can all perform acts of reflection, to be sure, observes Husserl, and bring them within the apprehending glance of consciousness. Yet it has to be admitted, read properly, that is to say, with the impropriety that expropriation announces, there is, Husserl continues, no field of pure consciousness, which is not a portion of nature itself. And this, I take it, as a step. There was at one point a lot of criticism of Husserl for being idealist, for not historicising. And I think that something is missed in Husserl, which is that consciousness is not pure consciousness. That is not phenomenological apperception. It's when one realises one is enfolded with the world. That's when bracketing takes place for him. And I think that's something that in certain ways the young Derrida tried to rescue by reading the late notebooks of Husserl in some of Derrida's first publications and the work that went towards his unfinished doctoral thesis. Husserl continues, it is possible only as an intentional unity, this field of consciousness in relation to nature, that is grounded in immanent organisations, such as we find in poems. They are necessary that we may know further, for, to continue with Husserl, nature is the principle placed within the bracket, in the form of a phenomenological reduction that is something totally different from the mere abstraction of certain components of an embracing organisation, whether the connections be necessary or merely factual. Poetry has this possibility, I think, because of its fragmentation, its expropriative opening. Such an act of bracketing is there, or can be. I'm not saying every poet does this. Husserl's insight, in conclusion, is invaluable. But moving forward, it is necessary that we supplement this somewhat. At the conclusion of part 2 of the phenomenology of perception, the thing in the natural world, Maurice Merleau-Ponty observes that the natural world is not the mind-independent totality of objects and properties conceived by realist natural science, thereby reinforcing and yet also inverting the implicit totalization of Husserl's somewhat idealist rendering. No, as Heidegger had argued in 1951, just 6 years after Merleau-Ponty had published the Phenomenology, and as Oswald and Burnside show us through the singular informatives that are their poems, we do not stand in a here separate from a there of the world as a mere series of perceived and represented objects. This relation will not remain as a static whole. Being comes to be given, and so expropriated in those moments where consciousness, as opposed to the world's calling, as gets to what Heidegger might call an inworlding. In this we find that we dwell, conscious of our being, our becoming expropriate. Ours is a thrownness, whereby we find ourselves in a given field, a field that gives itself, calling us to respond. Thomas Baldwin summarizes Merleau-Ponty's argument thus: the authentic natural world, he says, is retraced as the horizon of all horizons, which ensures that my experiences have a given, that is to say, a provisional, not a willed unity. I find myself touched by a given place that, in touching me, intimates the infinite. It is this unity that poetry temporarily houses, gives voice to place, voicing the land through the poet's being enfolded and responding to that opening brought about by the world. For the world, in the full sense of the word, and quoting Baldwin again, is not an objective totality, to stress this. Although it is wrapped in objective determinations, it also has fissures and lacunae through which subjectivities become lodged in it, or rather, which are subjectivities themselves. Determination, the reading of the self of the world, the tracing of the self in the world in the poetry of landscape, is both a wrapping in what is wrapped, given us for a moment as a fragment of consciousness, as the fragmentary exigency that makes possible our apperception. And I'd like to conclude with just a couple of poems, if I may. I want to shift from being a critic to being a poet, because I've come in recent years to thinking world, thinking land, not through eco-critical writings, save of course with Pace, because that was you the first person I read, and you convinced me that this was something that had real force and real power. So I hope I'm repaying the debt I owe you tonight. But I came back after a long hiatus from writing. I'd given up writing poetry. I'd given up doing a lot of things. And I came back to writing poetry, and so I've come back to the land through writing poetry. So I want to read a couple which are in those books. I asked people to suggest a couple to me. And I realise I've already used up my allotted time, so I shall choose a couple of short ones, and then an extract from a new poem that's not yet been published. This is called The Bird Watcher. The horse trader, in his ill-fitting shirt, stands in the tall window, his belly pressed awkwardly into the pane. The cold of a perfect winter's day touches his bowels. He feels an already familiar sensation, the caress of an old friend meaning harm. His heavy breath, rasping rattle, obscures the clarity of the scene. One hand braces the frame, expecting but shudder. Watching the wood, his eyes seek locally for signs of life among the firs shall see. Arranged just so, kinetic lights and darks, bark peeling, coiled strips. There is nothing he believes except perhaps a little flame. This next poem is called A Day. Nothing is as it was in childhood when we had to learn the names of objects and colours, and yet the eye can navigate a field, loving the way a random stoop of corn is orphaned not by shadows, not by light, but softly, like the tinder in a children's storybook, the stalled world raised to life around a spark, that tenderness in presence. Pale as the flame the sniper waits to catch across the yards of razor wire and ditching, thin as the light that falls from chapel doors, so everything it seems is resurrected, not for a moment, not in the sway of the now, but always, as the evening we can see, with all the others, all of history, the man climbing up from the tomb in a mantle of sulphur, the struck man wiping his hands in a blister of light. And I'll end with a fragment, appropriately, from a much longer poem, which actually is bound in part to Bath and Dorset. There is in the museum, in the local museum in Bath, a fragment of stone on which is a verse in Latin, which begins, the translation begins, strange to behold the walls of this age, broken by fate. And it's about time, the ruin of time, and it's a wonderful fragment of a poem. And I first read this when I actually, as a musician, I played here when it was a teacher training college. It was ages and disgracefully. And played also in Bowls, in the museum. And I've come across this, and it's stayed with me ever since, and I admired that for a number of reasons in the Latin. But also, I got to thinking about the landscape and family traces in the land around this area. About the literature of Anglo-Saxon and medieval poetry, and that kind of rubbed off on me in writing this. I was visiting in September. A wonderful, wonderful secluded spot on the Jurassic coast. And a poem came out of it, which, can we see? There it is, yes. Rest Day Variations, which became an album with some fairly strange improvisation, something fairly avant-garde. It's not for the faint of heart. But it is the sound of the land, I think. It literally is the sound of the land. There are larks from the area. There is an owl. There are bees. There are bells. This is called The View from West. Shard shivering, saw the cloud light to sever, cleaving closely the covering tumult. Cumulus delirium illuminated blazon, ocean sibilance shield, sundering ominous so. The lower world was heaven tending, gold-torn cried, sending sails in billowing. Bigya is the old Norse, once heard across the golden cap, astounded at the sight. Bellying undulate, those rent and rendered silks, electrifying, even those, yes, those more common colours come to sense, teal touch, gunmetal greys, top tarnished, with spittle whites fast flecking, tapping wave with lily, ocean's osier working the waters, waft and surge, winter anticipate and an autumnal equinox, suggestive of silent depths, the winter light of dark seas, still to come in this, not yet here, so soon arriving, dead, desert season drowned in the pitch, though aiming now ahead of time's delivery at cliff's edge, by analytic strand, a sigh, a sow, expatiating days late grace. Broken from the object implies time, deferral, the supplementary process taking place, because the programme dictates before we think the habitual, the shapes wherein our memories take form, those dwellings we inhabit. Thinking incorrectly, we have made those shapes, those structures that house our unrestrained perceptions, giving godlike order and perspective, necessary depth, focal field, as if the seeing was so much, as if acuity of ground did everything that mattered. The photograph, the memory, the making manifest, the search, the undertow, reaching after instant's truth, supplying in recollection of experience the clearing, those known by their clothing as if this were their name. Wolfheidnar, descending down the mouth's corruptions, so many wolves in sheep's clothing, once walked precarious the escarpment's edge, stepping out into the sky, skirting the scree, the shale, the slip surrendering to step out of time, from off Stone Barrow into Seven Window, settlement at the Stone River. Very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. I've got various questions, but I shall hold back, except to ask if you have any sort of expected timeline for the publication of this poem in process.
West Hay is not yet published. published. I've got a collection of poems which are ongoing at the moment. And as soon as I can publish it, really, because I've also got another project, a related project, which is part story, part poem. It's a hybrid. It's intermediate, as you say. It's interdisciplinary.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Looking forward to it. Okay, questions, comments? Richard.
Well, I have two actually, if that's all right, but they link to think. You made this distinction between two sorts of data writing. Between, on the one hand,
I knew I'd regret this.
the data writing that involves giving oneself up,
Yeah.
and what you call a perception or expropriation. And on the other hand, the type that you identified with Robert Macfarlane, and also, rather not surprisingly, with Wordsworth, as involving a desire for mastery. Now, my first question about that is how exactly would that map onto the familiar distinction between the Olsen-esque tradition of open form and open field poetry as opposed to what is more often called mainstream narrative poetry or poetry from the speaking eye. So that's my first question, but I think the second, which I think is connected with it, is how far does this a-perception or expropriation as a kind of stance, how far is that incompatible with taking a critical stance about landscape, or at least a position that involves desire and fear and the full range of subjectivity, really. But particularly, how far does it rule out criticism, or does it itself constitute a kind of criticism?
I think, just to start from the end of your question and work backwards if I can, with also the kind of, I want to say about Wordsworth that I have moments of I have an ambiguous relationship with Wordsworth. I sometimes feel he wants to create and control, and he's standing, he's looking a few miles above Tinton Abbey or beyond Tinton Abbey, and there he is, his eyes framing the world as he sees it, and it's very much a painful representation of the world. And he can't help that. That's the sign of historicity within the text, I think. So I kind of give him a little more leeway. I think partly my reaction to Wordsworth when it's negative is governed by Book 7 of The Prelude. He doesn't like London because it's filled with difference, and he wants to run away so that everything can be peaceful and one and harmonious. And I think that's a Wordsworth I don't particularly care for. I don't care for the Wordsworth who suddenly realises that the revolution is bloody and becomes the person who calls men of Kent to arms in the name of Shakespeare. So there are different Wordsworths, obviously, and I have different moments of embracing it and not wanting to be. That's in passing. But to go to the end of your question first, I've never been wholly of the phenomenological camp. I think that the apperceptive approach, the opening of the self, is a necessary step. I think it's a first step in, to use the phrase from Corinthians, to be still and know. If maybe Zen as well, it's giving oneself up to what the land is, what the world is, and letting that in. But then risking the critical gesture. And that's where the Derridian side of it comes in, because as Debbie Dale will say, you cannot not make a choice. You cannot not, even avoidance is a choice, even avoidance is a decision. And the decision has to be made. So knowing all the while that very well I could make the wrong decision, and my criticism could be an involvement and a return to an attempt to control the field. Nevertheless, one has to kind of surrender in the moment. This is why I think the at the moment and the unbidden flows of memory in Bernstein, the act that at any moment that Alice Oswald uses, those things that come upon us give us the possibility of dwelling in the sense that Heidegger wants to give us and talk about, even though his model is somewhat too static, I think. And I think it's how then do we respond? How then do we make a critical step? How then do we, having that critical break, that opening, what do we do next? That's where the criticism comes, and it's trying to be, for me, I partially quoted, I rephrased Conrad in the middle of that paper, and I think that's where the criticism comes in, whether it's through conventional critical work, whether it's through a hybrid, whether it's through doing things like this, or writing poetry, or whatever other endeavour we take on. It's wanting to get other people to see, to feel, to hear. But at the same time, this is something else I take from Derrida, not telling you how to think about something, but making it possible maybe, or risking that something might open up for you and anyone to hear or see. And so then make a decisive critical shift or step for themselves. I'm not wanting to write a program here, I'm wanting to kind of like say, why don't we look at it from this side, and why don't we allow ourselves a moment of just hanging around the field a while, and maybe we'll see something that we hadn't thought about before, because we were too busy putting a road through the field. I hope that begins to answer your question.
Yes, it begins to answer.
I think criticism is necessary. I think it's the next step beyond the apperceptive. The apperceptive, I can't make myself.
What I'm asking is, does it leave you, in a sense, unable to make any qualitative distinction between the field and the road? Since you have to be open to them all.
I think the nature of what they are means that you're never open to them in the same way. Each is a singularity, and therefore one's response has to be different in every case. And at the same time, one can't always equally be open to everything. To go back to the experience that I cited of, the sudden moment of Bach meeting crows on an autumn run, that's not going to work for everybody else. Hearing Bach cello suites can absolutely suspend time for me. It can absolutely take me out of the world and place me all the more in it, and then I resume everyday life of whatever it is I do. But that's not going to necessarily happen for you. Bach might not do it for you, something else might. I know a good friend of mine who teaches at Warwick cannot not get up and dance when he hears the Rolling Stones. For me, I want to leave the room, and we agree to disagree on this one. So I think everyone's being open, is at the apperception. That's the difficulty with phenomenology, is that Husserl is wanting to say we have to do this, we have to be aware of it. But then again he says, well, of course, but having a moment of reflection is not bracketing. Derrida, and so did Derrida, would perhaps suggest that the bracketing is what takes place. It is, in Derrida's terms, the il y a, the there that comes to me, that suddenly arrives, that future that can't be. There is something always coming towards me as the future, and there is the programmed future, which Derrida distinguishes as la future, and there is the future which can't be programmed, l'avenir, to come. And the to come can happen at any moment. It could happen when we go for dinner tonight. The bracketing takes place. It gives itself, it calls to me, and if I don't see it, I don't see it, and the same for everyone. So I guess if that directs me in a different direction, that's when the criticism can begin. And I hope it does, and I hope it has. As I said, writing poetry was what got me to thinking about landscape, about things in a different way, more so than reading criticism. I remember reading Jonathan Bates' book when it first came out, and it was an interesting book, but I didn't feel that it spoke particularly to me to use that kind of language. In the same way that, actually going for a walk across a field, or hearing a crow, or hearing an owl actually does all the time. There's something very, very different there.
we've got another question from Terry, but I just wanted to give you the chance to respond to the other question about open field poetics versus some more conventional poetic forms.
I mean, they're both conventions by now, of course.
Yes.
They are, of
Yes.
course, yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think that negotiation with the eye is a fascinating one. And is the eye common for open field poetry, I wonder? True. There is some kind of controlling voice there. But I'm thinking, Oswald is for me, the poet at the moment who deliberately and repeatedly tries to reduce the voice, tries to lose the eye. She puts it in very, very infrequently. She tries to give voice to other things like a stone, to wood, to the dawn itself in frightfulness, in fall. It's a question that I'm not sure I have a full answer for you, and it will be something I'd love to talk with you more about at length and come back to. And I haven't read Olson for a long time, and I'd like to get back to that.
Well, I mean, he's one of the most interesting poets, Frank Olson. But particularly the whole principle of projective verse, I suppose, is what you're talking about.
Yeah, I need to think more about that, and I would very happily to go. Bother me with emails, and I'll happily respond to you.
Well, he's coming to dinner.
Oh, good.
Terry.
I think my question follows on from Richard's, and in a sense is simpler. In this moment of opening up, which is fundamental to any engagement of the artist with land, you're not presuming, are you, that there is a stable land to be opened up to? And it seems to me that part of the problem of the difficulty of dissolving the ego in order to open up is that the land itself is contested, of course, and is a multi-inhabited environment of contestations and harmonies and tensions and so on. And I'd just like you to say a bit more about that, really, in the way in which you've been talking about this notion of opening up to the voice of the land.
Let me come at this through Virginia Woolf to start off with. I recall at a certain point in my education reading a number of critics on Woolf who criticised her for what they saw as assuming the land she wrote about, in which her characters have visions of a certain Englishness that, if not timeless, certainly persists, as being it wouldn't have been described as politically incorrect at the time, but a politically incorrect Englishness because it was so southern. Specifically, it was Sussex, it was the Downs, and so on and so forth. But and there is a contest around this whole question of is she a favoured landscape writer because she doesn't write about Yorkshire or she doesn't write about Cumbria, as though these were, as though she was doing something wrong. And I think, I know, yes, you're convicted of not ever having written about the Dales. I think I understand what she's doing simply because it is the place that touches you, the place that moves you, and that still is a contested landscape, of course. But one of the reasons I moved back to England after teaching in the States for 15 years was I found that I recognised nothing about the Florida landscape. The Florida landscape didn't speak to me in particular ways that Dorset and Sussex do. So there is a call and a response, and I think that one of the things that Woolf does is she risks everything. Here may be where the criticism comes in. If the criticism is also creative writing, is that she risks everything on imagining a fragment that she takes as representative of Englishness, but that fragment then stands in for a whole which she doesn't describe because the whole can't be described. And she doesn't have this empathetic response to Yorkshire, Leicestershire, East Anglia, wherever. I think there is generally a question here to be considered, not only of, but I guess what I'm trying to say in part answer to your question is that there is no such thing as a response to the landscape, which is not at once a personal one and also one which is thoroughly engaged with a certain politics of that landscape, that wants to bear witness to whatever for the self is most valid in that registration and representation of land at a particular place, whether it's a built environment or whether it's a natural one. And again, as I said in the paper, natural is a concept, it's not natural. It is something that we choose to construct in particular ways, and we are quite happy to go as far as we want with our own particular valorisation of what the land is in particular ways. That's not to say a place that is not home, doesn't call to you with that sense of dwelling, can't touch you in that powerful way. Sometimes a very alien or a very different landscape can do that, and it calls in particular ways. I think perhaps going back to, I think my own, for me, the ur-text, if you will, of landscape and home is found very early on in The Wind in the Willows. And it's in The Wind in the Willows, in an absolutely heartbreaking place where Mole is following Rat across the field in winter, and it's snowing. And Mole, of course, can't keep up because his legs aren't as long as Rat's. And he smells something, and he smells home. And it absolutely crushes him. And it's so powerful, and that's always called to me since I first read it. And I can't define what that is. And yeah, you can say that, well, Graham is an Edwardian Tory, and I'm not, by the way. I may be Edwardian, but I'm not Tory. Who knows? That's that powerful enigma of the call, for me, is the motivating thing. And then let's get down to the nitty-gritty of looking at specific landscapes, and let's talk about each one in each example. I wouldn't want to risk an abstraction or a generalisation. I'm take me to a field and let's talk about it, I think is what I was saying.
Yeah, I was just interested in what you were saying about bracketing, because if the analogy, if you're standing in the field and you yield to it, and that's a duration, experiencing it, and then there's a consummation coming to an end of it, which enables you to talk about sort of like a poem or whatever. Is that what you mean by bracketing?
In part, yes. I don't know that you can control that. I mean, not to sound glib, but I could go and stand in the field and come away with nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And in the same way, the built environment gives me all manner of poems. The collection Grand European Vestry is full of European reflections that have been occasioned by travelling and being an outsider in various landscapes, in various places that are part built, part natural, and so on and so forth. So the bracketing is something that can come. And again, Wolf gives us some lovely examples. Into the Lighthouse, to take one example, Mr. Ramsay is worrying about logic and about philosophical arguments. And Mrs. Ramsay slows time and kind of just opens herself, and there's this wonderful gendered opposition to analytical philosophy, which is just this marvellous affirmation of something completely other. And Clarissa Dalloway does similar kinds of things. You know, there's Richard walking back with flowers for her, and he stops by Queen Victoria's statue, and he's in this landscape, and he's thinking, oh, I wish it could still be the same as it was when the old Queen were alive. And there's Clarissa Dalloway embracing this kind of giving up, to, you know, what a lark, and just kind of going with the flow of it, and being in the moment, And so there's a real kind of, to me, there's a real kind of gender politics that goes on in a lot of writing around the nature of place and landscape, whether it's, again, it's urban or rural.
I just want to go back to this distinction that you raised, the anti Wordsworth, whatever.
Yeah, let's say anti-McFarlane.
Well, okay, but you call me an old cynic.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure I buy the whole yielding to the field thing anyway.
No.
I mean, not really, even your own account,
Yeah.
you're talking about listening to the bar.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that is basically turning your head into a film camera with a movie soundtrack.
Sure.
You know, to some extent you are distancing yourself, not yielding to, and to my, I always come back to Camus with this stuff and the myth of Sisyphus.
Sure.
And this sense that we are unalterably alienated from our environment through self-consciousness, through, and if I were a cat, I would be one among many cats. If I were a tree, but I can't.
No.
And so I'm condemned to roll and roll.
Yeah.
I can do this life alone. And I guess I find it. I suppose what I'm responding to is this is me being annoying, I'm sure, but in a way, kind of, you're saying, some things do it for you, some things don't do it for you. And maybe it's because I'm a Yorkshireman, but I'm finding it very difficult to tune into the particular wavelength that you're presenting with your work, and that's. So I guess there's a whole kind of, it's a matter of sensibilities as much as anything else.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that a concern against novel?
I think, yes, probably.
Do you get many film watches in Yorkshire?
I think we're a bit more rough.
You're just feeling bullish because you've got the new captain of the England cricket team. I mean, seriously. I do.
Okay. I don't know, it's...
there are several things there.
Yeah.
First of all, that alienation is what is in that quotation from Heidegger, which I started off with as an epigraph. So I agree with you totally on that. My cat watches me pushing the bowler up the hill and says, "Why bother?" I know she does. She's there all the time. Secondly, you can't open yourself. It's not a conscious thing, and I think that's the aporia within Husserl's thought, and which people like Merleau-Ponty try to solve by turning to painting and to the visual arts, because you can work through a kind of critical exegesis that leads you to seeing differently with certain things. You can't consciously bracket yourself. I mean, Kant in this respect, I think, is much more forward-thinking than Husserl, who wants to hold on to the consciousness. Whereas Kant, in the third critique, the sublime is just, well, there you are, you're at the beach, there's the ocean, there's the sky, and whoa, and it just hits you. And it doesn't do it for everybody, fine. You don't know it's going to do that, so it's not a conscious thing at all. For a lot of people, you go, oh, I've been off to the Alps, isn't that great, isn't it marvellous? I've been to the Outback, it's just stunning, it's mind-blowing, okay. It doesn't change my life one iota. I'm not suggesting that. You're still doing the same things all the time. There's a very pragmatic aspect here, which is that you can't tell. And this is ultimately, I keep coming back in my own thinking, in my criticism, always to Derrida, because Derrida may be wrong about some things, but he's less wrong about a lot of things than a lot of other thinkers, because he says, well, you still have to make a choice, you still have to make a decision, and you don't know what's coming toward you. There's always a possibility that something coming towards you will have an effect, and you simply can't say. It's impossible to say. It might come at you, it might go through you, and still, no change. We don't know. That's why, funnily, people have asked me about this whole thing with music and running, and it's not like, oh, I'm trying to get in touch with nature and just feel the run. I don't do that. The music for me is actually a way, and it's almost random, when I run, of tuning out my much as possible, a sense of me knowing what I'm doing. The music allows me to feel sun, it allows me to feel rain, it allows me to feel wind. It's about the tactility of the experience, so I can shut out my conscious, and not shut it down completely, don't. I'm not saying that. But, you know, I want to feel the world much more, and the music becomes a way of allowing me to feel the world much more so that things can take me by surprise. And hopefully it is a murder of crows coming out of the cops and not a Ford Transit van turning on suddenly and taking me out. So there is very much that sense that I realise I am absolutely alienated, but I also absolutely immersed in the world. I'm immersed to the extent that I don't notice it, unless something confronts me in a particular way and forces me to make a choice. And that can be as trivial as when I lived in Florida, going for runs and seeing turtles trying to cross roads, and knowing they would bake on the road surface in the 90-degree heat, and stopping to pick them up and to move them aside, or getting home and seeing little frogs climbing up the front door, and knowing if they stayed there, the sun would bake them, and I'd have frog croquettes on my front porch. So moving the frogs off. And I'm joking about this, but I think there are just little things every day that you engage with in various ways at a very non-critical, non-intellectual level. Phenomenology is problematic in its pure forms, precisely because it wants this consciousness to enact and engage in various ways. And it doesn't have answers for the limits of its own thinking. So I would prefer to go to strategically draw upon himself very carefully, but my own sense of phenomenology is much more with the provocations that someone like Heidegger can offer, the attempts at thinking aesthetics that Ponti makes possible, and simply that aporia that Kant reaches in the third critique, where he says, well, how do I get around this sublime? The sublime is just kind of black and straight between the eyes, and what do I do with that? And he says, well, by analogy. You can't get through it, you can't bridge the gap, so you step to the side. And I think that's why poetry, for me, kind of exists in certain ways. It works on that level of a kind of analogy. It's the relation of non-relation. It's two completely unlike things, and trying to say something or grasp something, and being active in that process.
There's a thinker, Jeffrey Pepys, who said that experience isn't just an experience, it's a process which is critical and adaptive. So when you're jogging or whatever, you're playing music, your body's in a state of movement. Experiencing, but it's embedded within it is a critical, adaptive, felt response. It's not just like a nice feeling.
No.
Is it?
It is. There's a paradox there. You know, when I write music, I sometimes will sit and play without thinking about what it is I'm trying to do. I'm not consciously trying to compose a piece. I'm not sitting down saying, oh, I'm going to write this, but I'll start by sitting and just simply playing the same phrase on the piano or on the guitar over and over and over again, and just letting that go, and then recording that, and then going back to that and thinking, is there something there? And maybe then improvising, knowing all the while that improvisation is not a possibility. It's still coming from somewhere, and it's still being dictated by what you've learned, how you've practiced, how you do your scales, whatever. And all of the musical influences that you've listened to, and so on and so forth. But I think that Eliza Carthy, I think, said it very, very well when she recorded an album with her father. She said we decided we were going to do a number of traditional songs that we hadn't done ever before, and she said there was this process whereby you're very consciously learning them, and before we recorded, what we want to do is to keep playing them over and over and over again until we felt like we weren't learning them, until they became skins for us, and then we'd go and record them and see what we discovered. And I think there's partly that process, and that's at least what I try to do with what we're talking about.
We probably need to just about wrap up in the interest of having a drink and having a look at the books and things. I just want to quickly suggest in response to some of this discussion that I think that there is an element of critique in the in an eco-phenomenology or an eco-poetic phenomenology, in a sense, implicitly in that it's kind of renunciation of an instrumental view of the field. It's kind of a letting go of that view of the field as something that you're going to make money from. It becomes, you know, a place where you might be surprised, where your preconceptions might be challenged. And so there is an ethic and a moment of critique about this sort of cultivation of a comportment of responsiveness. The challenge is, I suppose, in a context in which you know, it's necessary to make choices, to take a stand, to engage politically, to make that bridge from responsiveness to responsibility. And I'm not sure, you know, maybe that's something that happens beyond the poem, that you can't expect a category error to expect the poem to give you your politics. The poem cultivates a kind of a readiness to respond to things on their own terms, but then you've got to kind of think through the implications of that for politics subsequently.
I think that's absolutely right. I'd agree with that 100%. And that the poetry is just one of the things that we do. I think we all, most of us, I hope all of us. Let's say everyone here, everyone outside this room, they don't, but we do. I think we all try to do the best we can with the politics we invest in and believe in, and we try to live that. Recognising all the while, to paraphrase a very much used argument, but when I feed my cat, every other cat in the world starves.
Right. Exactly. So this is that's where Derrida is helpful too, that, you know, we've got to make choices, but they will always be on some level the wrong choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
From a certain perspective. On that cheery note, I will invite you to thank Julian once again.